The transatlantic slave trade, spanning from the 16th to the 19th centuries, was one of the darkest chapters in human history. So, what were the main causes of the transatlantic slave trade? The transatlantic slave trade was caused by several factors. First, there was an increasing need for labor on plantations in the Americas, especially in the production of sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Second, European countries such as Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain were looking for new sources of profit and resources. The slave trade became part of the colonial economy, where black slaves were used to mass-produce goods for the European market. Interesting fact: at the peak of the slave trade in the 18th century, more than 12 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, and about 1.5 million of them died en route. What was the process of capturing and selling slaves in Africa? The process of capturing slaves was brutal and systematic. European slave traders collaborated with local African rulers who captured people from neighboring tribes and sold them into slavery. Slaves were often kept in horrible conditions while awaiting transportation. Interesting fact: slave traders used so-called slave markets in African port cities such as Lagos and Accra, where they could trade slaves with European ships. How were slaves transported across the Atlantic? Slaves were transported on special ships known as slave ships. They were crowded with people, many of whom were bound in chains. The journey to the Americas lasted from 6 to 12 weeks, depending on the route and weather conditions. Interesting fact: each ship provided only a minimum amount of space for each slave, often less than 1 square meter per person, resulting in a high mortality rate from disease and starvation. What were the living conditions of slaves on plantations in America? The living conditions of slaves on plantations were extremely harsh. Work in the fields lasted from early morning to late evening, and slaves were often severely punished for the slightest misbehavior. Food was scarce, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Interesting fact: in some cases, slaves were forced to work 18 hours a day, and were often not provided with even minimal resting facilities. What impact did the slave trade have on African societies? The slave trade had a devastating impact on many African societies. It contributed to the weakening of local economies and social structures, leading to conflict and civil wars. Many tribes disintegrated and their populations were greatly reduced. Interesting fact: in some cases, entire communities were devastated as men and women who could have been leaders and protectors were captured and sold into slavery. How did the slave trade affect America's economy? The slave trade played a key role in the development of the economy of the American colonies. Slaves provided low labor costs, which allowed plantations to make huge profits. This, in turn, facilitated trade and industry. Interesting fact: it is estimated that the wealth derived from slave labor formed the basis for U.S. economic growth in the 18th century and helped finance industrialization. How was the slave trade justified in society? The slave trade was often justified on the basis of racist ideologies that claimed that Africans were an inferior race. These perceptions were used to legitimize the mistreatment and exploitation of slaves. Interesting fact: many preachers and philosophers of the time attempted to justify the slave trade through various theories, although many others opposed it, which eventually led to abolitionist movements in the 19th century. Question 8. What were the consequences of the abolition of the slave trade? The abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century brought about significant changes. Although legislative action was taken, many former slaves faced discrimination and poverty. However, the human rights movement began to gain momentum, which eventually led to the struggle for civil rights. Interesting fact: the British Empire officially banned the slave trade in 1807, but the illegal trade continued for several more decades despite the bans. Question 9. What was the role of women in the transatlantic slave trade? Women played an important role in both the slave trade and in the lives of slaves. Many slave women were sexually abused by their masters, resulting in the birth of mixed children who could also be sold into slavery. Interesting fact: a slave woman who could bear children with a white master often had a higher value in the slave market, creating additional suffering and hardship for Black women. Question 10. What legacy did the transatlantic slave trade leave? The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to influence contemporary society. Issues of racial justice, inequality, and cultural identity remain relevant. The memory of the suffering of slaves and their descendants is important for understanding contemporary social issues. Interesting fact: many African and African American cultures still retain elements from their ancestral cultures, demonstrating a rich heritage despite tragic circumstances. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex and tragic process that had a profound impact on the history, economy, and culture of both Africa and the Americas. Studying this topic is essential to understanding the modern world and its social structures.